Hello! In this video, I'm going to introduce you to something called Bootstrap. If you haven't heard before, Bootstrap is one of the most popular projects ever for developers. And what it is just a CSS file and JavaScript file. But why would that be one of the most popular projects? Well, one thing you might have noticed is that writing CSS from scratch is a bit of a pain. Wouldn't it be nice if you can use something that has already been created by somebody so that not every single developer has to keep reinventing the wheel and keep writing everything from scratch? And that is the idea behind Bootstrap. Bootstrap was created to solve this problem so that we can create websites really, really fast by using somebody else's CSS and building on top of it. There's also another project called Foundation that does the same thing, and they have their own styles. But again, Bootstrap is the more popular of the two, so we'll focus on that. If we click on Get Started here, it'll have a quick setup instruction, and in the next video, we'll actually build something with Bootstrap. But I wanted to show you, if you go down to Components, what the big sell of Bootstrap is. And that is, it has all of these things pre-built for you. So if I wanted to, let's say, have a navigation bar, well, that's already built for me with drop downs and links. And all I have to do is copy and paste this code. And you'll see over here that they already have classes attached to them. And these classes will be associated with the CSS file that I will download for Bootstrap. So anytime I use something like navbar, it will use the default Bootstrap styles. And there's many things that you can do. As you can see, all I need to do is copy and paste this code and I have myself a card. You can imagine how fast making websites is with this. Now, the one thing I do want to point out is you might be asking, why do I need to also download JavaScript? We haven't really learned that topic yet in this course. And there are some things in Bootstrap, such as drop-down menus. You can see how they're adding behavior, some actions to our website. If I go to, let's say, modals, for example, and I click on Launch Demo Modal, well, this uses JavaScript because there's some action within our website. We won't worry too much about that, and that's something we'll get into when we get to the JavaScript section. But you can see here that with Bootstrap, by just downloading a CSS file and a JavaScript file, we have all these tools at our disposal. Now, you might be asking yourself one other thing, and that is, well, if everybody uses these, won't we all have the same looking websites? And no, the beauty of Bootstrap is that these are just building blocks. You have all these classes that you can use, but then you can add your own custom CSS styles on top of these to make it different. So if I go to buttons, for example, well, by using these classes, I have all these beautiful buttons. But if I wanted to change the behavior of button primary, which is this one, I could create my own CSS file and just put it right after the Bootstrap file and change the primary color to, let's say, orange. And just to show you, if you go to the Expo tab here, Bootstrap actually has a whole bunch of websites that have been built with Bootstrap. And you can see that they all look very, very different. So in the next video, we're going to build ourselves a Bootstrap website. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. Let's start using Bootstrap. And there are two ways we can use this toolkit. One is to download. And you can just click on the first link. It says compiled CSS and JavaScript. Well, let's just see what gets downloaded. So if I open this, you'll see here that I have a CSS file and JavaScript file. You see there's a bunch of them. You don't have to worry too much about it. It's just different CSS files that are used together based on if you're using the Bootstrap grid or the Bootstrap CSS. And you'll see some of them have the bootstrap.min.css. And that means that they are minified. So if I open this, you'll see that everything is on one line and minified. Right now, all we would need to do is just add this to our project, but I want to show you a better way of doing it, especially when we're getting started. And that is, we can use something called a CDN. So what is a CDN? A CDN is a content delivery network. Bootstrap has this link and they're hosting the Bootstrap CSS files for us. So we don't even need to include it in our project. All we need to do is add this line into our HTML, and you'll see here that the link tag, which refers to a style sheet, has an href that links us to the Bootstrap minified CSS. And that's what a content delivery network is. We don't need to include our files into our project. We just link to someplace else that is actually hosting this file. So let's copy that. Let's open up Sublime, and I'm going to create a new file here, and we'll save it to the desktop. And we'll call it index.html. I save, and let's open that up in the browser as well. Okay, empty because, well, we don't have anything. Here, let's start with our HTML page, and we'll title it Bootstrap. And again, we have that link copied, which is the CDN that says, hey, I want the CSS file from Bootstrap. If you scroll down to the bottom, it also has the JavaScript file. And like I said before, we need these files if we're using features of Bootstrap, such as dropdowns or modals, that actually add some actions to our websites. So let's just copy this. And where we want to put JavaScript, and again, when we get to that section in this course, we'll talk more about it. We want to put it at the bottom of our body tag. And that is because you want these JavaScript files to load after all the content of your websites have loaded. This way, we have our website loaded and then these scripts get downloaded. If we put these at the top, you'll have to wait for all of them to load before a user can see your website. And obviously, that's not what we want to do. Okay, and this is all we need to have Bootstrap working for us. So let's play with a few things. Let's say we wanted to add a navbar. I would go into the components and select navbar. And you can read about how it works, but I really like this navigation bar. So I'm just going to copy the code and add it to my body. And I know it can get overwhelming when you're copying a whole bunch of code and you don't know exactly what it's doing. But if you actually read this line by line, you know everything. It's just a few tags with their own specific Bootstrap classes. So let's save here and refresh. And look at that. We have a navigation bar. How easy is that? And one thing that Bootstrap is really famous for, and why people love it so much, is that it's fully responsive. So you see the menu bar here. If I make it bigger, look at that. It automatically changes according to what we need. Okay, what else can we add over here? Let's add a Jumbotron. Hello world. Okay, so I can copy this. And again, let's add that right below the nav bar. So again, in Sublime Text, I can minimize this by clicking the side over here. And below the nav bar, we'll add this Jumbotron. Okay, so if I save and refresh, look at that. We have hello world. Let's add one last thing. We'll do a modal. And with the modal, I really like this one, launch demo modal. So I'm going to copy this. And again, I'm going to minimize the Jumbotron just so we can see what we've added. Copy and paste this. Always have to adjust my indentation. Perfect. And I save this and refresh. We have the launch demo modal. And if I click this, look at that. We have our own modal. Now, this, just to prove that this is JavaScript, if I remove these scripts, I'm just going to comment them out, and I click this, nothing happens. And that's what JavaScript is doing. We'll get into it, like I said, later, but there are some features that might not work with Bootstrap if you don't include these scripts. But if you're only using it for styles, then you might not even need these. So if I remove this, if you saw, we still have all of these, but the nav bar isn't working anymore. So again, you can play around and see what you need. You don't need to know exactly what these scripts do yet, so just leave them there for now. Now, how can we change the style so that we can add our own custom look to our website? Well, if we wanted to change something like the launch demo modal button, well, in that case, I can see over here that this is the button, and I can look at the classes that Bootstrap gives us. If I go into buttons, well, here I can see that all these classes have, all these colors have different names. So if I want it to be red, I can use button danger. So again, I can remove primary. Actually, I can just type this out. Instead of primary, I can do danger, save, and refresh. And now the button's red. But again, what if you want your own custom look to the button? Well, that's easy to do. We can now say that from now on, I want button danger to be orange. The way we do that is we create a style sheet at the top. And now we can add our own style sheet, and you can see it's below the Bootstrap one, which means that according to cascading style sheets, our styles will override anything that might match the Bootstrap ones. So let's create a style file here. And I actually have one created already on our desktop. You can see it over here in the same directory as the index.html. And here we can say that the button danger that we just added has a background color of orange. If I save this and refresh, look at that. Our button is now orange. And the hover effect is still red, and that's default Bootstrap. So we can do button danger hover is going to be black. Save and refresh. Look at that. We have our own custom button. You can see Bootstrap is very powerful. We're able to create websites really, really fast this way. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the best feature of Bootstrap that I have yet to tell you about. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. And welcome back. We left off with our really quick website that we built using Bootstrap. But I want to show you one thing that I've kept from you, and that is the layout feature in Bootstrap. And this was the primary reason that Bootstrap was so popular. Because layout was so difficult and we didn't have Flexbox back in the day, Bootstrap allowed us to create very responsive websites using these ideas of columns. To show you what I mean, we're going to create our own column system. We're going to go back to our website, and I'm going to delete everything that we created so far. I'm going to save and refresh. Everything's empty. So in Bootstrap, you can do something like this. You always want to wrap everything in a container. And again, if you go to the documentation, it'll show you what to do. And we'll just grab the top ones. So let's just copy these, fix the indentation a bit. There you go. And if I refresh, well, we need to have a bit of a background so we can see them. So I'm going to say column. We'll do background color gray, and the border will be 2 pixels solid black. Save and go back and refresh. We have our borders. Now here's something interesting that you can do. You can do column small 6 and then column small 3. Don't worry, I'll explain what that means. I'm going to refresh and look at that. The size of this just got smaller. And that is because Bootstrap has the idea of a grid system, and this grid system has 12 lines. So 6 plus 3 is 9. So it's saying that I want this column to have 6 spaces out of that 12, and this column to have 3 spaces out of that 12. So if we add another column, and 6 plus 3 plus 3 is 12, I'm going to say extra here. I refresh, you'll see that it fills in this gap. What if I put in 4 here? So that is 13, which is over 12. Well, if I refresh, this goes down to the next level. So you see how easy it is to control things in Bootstrap. I could also do something like column extra small. We'll do 12, and then column extra small 6, column extra small 6. And actually we'll do medium here. Save. Let's refresh and see what happens. Whoa. What this is saying that if the size of the window is medium, then I want the whole 12 grid system to the first div, and then 6 of the 12 to the second, and then the extra one, 6. So you can see here that that's medium. But because we have these small properties in here, if I make it smaller, you can see that it resorts down to the 6, 3, 4 grid. Let's change this back to 3 so it looks better, and show you that there's a few other sizes that we can add. You can see over here that we have grid options, and we have small, medium, large, and extra large. So let's do large and see what happens. So for large, I want to have everything on their own. So we can do this. And save. Let's refresh and see if you can guess what's about to happen. I'm going to go from medium to large. Do you see that? 12, 12, 12. So I want each div to occupy 12 spaces, 12 grid systems, which is the full thing. If I go to medium, I now occupy with the first one, 12. The second one's 6 and 6. So they should be one after another. And if I go down to even smaller, the small will have 6, 3, and 3. So this is how you can create really responsive websites. And that was the biggest selling feature of Bootstrap. It was solving this really, really hard problem of making sure that our website looked good no matter what the screen size. So I want you to play around with the grid options here. This is the hardest concept to grasp in Bootstrap. Once you've learned this, it's very, very easy to create websites extremely fast. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Holy moly. Good job getting this far in the course. You should really, really be proud of yourself because we've learned a lot. And now we're going to build something really exciting. We're going to build a startup landing page. A landing page like this that, well, is responsive. But most importantly, it has some text, it has a button. But check this out. When you click on the button, it takes you to a form to sign up and collect email addresses. That's right, we're building a startup landing page. I'm going to show you how to do it step by step. And you can grab the starter files attached to this lesson because we're going to build this from scratch and see how we can put something online that you can now share with your friends next time you have a big startup idea. Let's get started. Welcome back. So how are we going to build this from scratch based on what we've learned so far? Well, we're going to use Bootstrap for this because we just learned it. And I actually gave you some starter files attached to the last lesson. If we take a look, that's right, we had a header image, we had an index.html file, and then a style.css file. So you can open these, make sure they're all in the same folder. I called mine startup with an exclamation mark because this is an exciting project. And in our case, we'll use Sublime Text. We should have something like this. So we have our index.html file, our style.css, and then our header image. Now I filled in a few things for you just to get us started. Nothing too crazy though, don't worry. One is we've used some Google fonts so that we can use this Montserrat font, which I think is kind of nice from the Google fonts. And we enable that in our style sheet by saying body and HTML. I want to make sure that the font family has this setting. If not, we'll use sans serif. I've also set width and height for 100%. That's always something good to have to make sure that the body and HTML cover 100% of whatever we see on the screen. Next, we have our Bootstrap CSS from a CDN, or a content delivery network. And the reason I've added this here is that so you don't have to actually include a Bootstrap file yourself. If I actually go to the Bootstrap page and I go to Quick Start, you'll see that right here, we can just copy and paste this, just like here, with the Bootstrap CSS file. So that way, right away, as soon as we copy and paste this line, we have Bootstrap available to us. Now, notice here how we have versions of Bootstrap. In this case, it's 4.3.1. Now, this number, as the time passes, is going to get bigger and bigger because Bootstrap is a constantly evolving library as developers make updates. But as long as you use a number higher than this, everything in this project should work. Like I said, most of the time, no matter when you're watching this video, as long as you copy this or you use my starter files, everything should work. And then finally, we have our style sheet. Nothing new here, right? Because we've already seen this before. We have our style.css file, and our style file just has this for now. We also have our header image, which again is a nice little laptop image for our startup landing page. Now, this is the website over here that is completely blank because we have nothing in the body. So let's just have a header one that says, hello, right here. Save it and refresh. Look at that. We have hello. Now, notice here how fast I did that. I just pressed Command R on my laptop, which is a Mac. If you have Windows, it's Control R to refresh the web page. And you notice here that the font is being applied once again because we have our font family CSS set. So there's our page, our setup, and there is what we want to get to. Now, if you want, you can go off on your own and try to attempt to build this from scratch yourself. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video to actually get our page to look a little bit more like this and less like this. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. All right, let's get going here. Now, the first thing we want to do is change this hello to, well, the biggest startup event of the year. Very dramatic, I know. So let's do that. I'm just going to say the biggest startup event of the year. That's right. Okay, let's save. So I'm doing Command S, or if you're on Windows, Control S. And then refresh, Command R, or if you're on Windows, Control R. All right, there we go. That's great. We also seem to have a button that says find out more. So let's do that as well. We'll say button, find out more. There we go. If I refresh here, there you go. Our startup landing page is, well, frankly, still looking fairly ugly. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to have this background image. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about how we can set up our HTML page so that we have good responsive design. So right now, nothing much is going on. You can see here that I can adjust the screen size, but we don't have much happening on our page. So if we go back to the Bootstrap documentation, in the Quick Start Guide, if I scroll all the way to the bottom, you see that I get a starter template here. And you might notice here something that we haven't seen before, which is this part over here, called a required meta tag. And you can see here that this is actually something that we can copy and paste and place right below our title here, just like that. Now, let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see. And I'll make the writing smaller just so you can see over here exactly what's happening. So this meta tag allows us to add new information to our HTML page. And there's different things that we can provide. Now, in most websites, you'll actually see these two lines very often. As a matter of fact, it's recommended that you always add them. Now, what exactly do they do? Well, if we scroll down here, you'll see that we have the responsive meta tag. Essentially, this line here, which says viewport, allows us to create web pages that are developed mobile first. That is, we let the page know, or the browser know, that this page should work on mobile devices, and things like scrolling or touching or zooming on a mobile device is going to work with this tag. Now, this is something I'm going to leave for you to learn more about, and it's something we'll talk about later in the course. But these meta tags are just useful things to add to our projects anytime we create a new page. And then finally, this top meta tag uses UTF-8 encoding. Essentially, it's saying, hey, we're going to use this form of encoding to write text on our pages. Again, something that if you're curious, you can read up on your own. But now that we've set this up so that it's good for mobile as well, let's try to include this background image into our page. Now, when it comes to background images on a website, that's a very common thing. You'll see a lot of people adding background images to a website, or maybe patterns or some sort of colors. And when a common problem happens, I always like, Googling. And one of the first things that you'll encounter is this perfect full page background image by CSS Tricks, which we've seen before. Now, if you scroll all the way down, it tells us a way for us to make sure that we use the image in a full page background so that it stretches, it flexes as the viewport changes. Now, over here, it actually gives us a copy and paste way that we can use it ourselves. So I'm going to just copy this, go to my style page, and just add this to our CSS. Now you'll see over here that we're using background over here with the URL. So we want to adjust it to header.jpg because that's the URL of the header. And the key here is these lines. It's saying, hey, we don't want to repeat the image. We want you to keep it centered, and we want you to keep it fixed. And by using this line, it stretches, or at least it fills the entire page with our image. And as long as we have background size as cover, well, let's see what happens. I'm going to refresh. Hey, and look at that. Now I have this image that adapts to our page. But the cool part is if I open the developer tools here, let's say View, Developer Tools, you'll notice that the image actually bumps up so that the center of the image, is always centered. How cool is that? So this is a very useful trick to have your background very flexible. All right, so we have our background. Unfortunately, our writing right now is hard to see. The button's still kind of ugly. So let's fix a few things in our HTML page. Now remember, we have Bootstrap, so we can start using some Bootstrap classes now. One thing that I want to do is with this H1 tag, I want to maybe use a strong element to emphasize the header. So make sure we close this. And I'm going to make this bigger just so you can see. And if I refresh, all right, that's emphasized a little bit more. We also want to make sure that this H1 tag we can actually see. So we can go into our style and just create a new H1 style that will have, let's say, a font size of, let's say, 3 REM. And then we'll give it a color of, what should we do here? Well, one thing that I always like to do when I'm trying to figure out what color I want is to go to a page, let's say like the startup over here, open up the developer tools, make sure this is a little bit bigger so we can see, and then find somewhere on the page where you have this color palette. If I actually click on this and I'm on Chrome, look at that. It opens up a little color palette for us. So I can actually move around things and grab the hex of the color that I want. In our case, I want the color to be, well, let's find out. How can I copy the color of this page? I can just click on select an element, this little icon here. And then if I hover over this, look at that. It shows me exactly what color this element has. You can see over here that this is the hex color. So I'm just going to copy that, come back, and paste it in. Now if I save both of these files and refresh, that's much better. I like that a lot. All right, we're making progress with our page. It's getting closer, but we still have a lot to do. So let's take a break, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, everybody, let's keep going. What else can we do to this page to make it look more like this one? Well, I want the text uppercased here. You can see over here that this is all in capitals, this is not. I mean, I could change this if I want to capital letters. I can also add a style to make everything uppercase. But there's also another useful one that comes with Bootstrap. I can actually add a class and use a class in Bootstrap called text-uppercase. If I save this and refresh, look at that. Everything is uppercased. That's awesome. Now, what about the button? Let's add some Bootstrap styling to the buttons. Again, let's say you don't know how to add Bootstrap styles or you don't know the classes. We can always go to the documentation and search buttons. There we go. We see that we have some button classes that we can use. In our case, let's use this one, button primary. So I'm going to copy, come back, and with this button, let's give it a class of button primary. If I save and refresh, hey, look at that. We have a Bootstrap button already. That's really, really cool. But you know what? I want to have a different color, right? I want the button to look more like this, something nicer. So we can add our own custom CSS. Let's call this class button XL for extra large button. And this isn't a Bootstrap class. If I save this and refresh, nothing will happen. Instead, we can create this button XL right here in our own style sheet. So let's say button or .button XL is going to be, let's make this a little bit bigger, is going to have padding of, let's say, 1 REM on the sides and 2 REM top bottom. If I refresh this, that's better. That's a lot bigger. So we have an extra large button. Now we can add sizes or we can add different properties here. But since we named this class button XL, we should just leave it the way it's describing things. That is to make the button larger. So instead, let's just modify the existing classes that we have, which is the button and button primary. So if I go back here, we can say that the button class will have a font weight of, let's say, 700 and a border radius. That is to make the edges more circular, and we'll give it 300 pixels. If I save this and refresh, that's a lot better. I like that. And I want this capitalized as well, and I could use the text uppercase class as we've seen before, or I can just in here say text transform and just say uppercase. So just use a CSS class. If I refresh, that looks really, really nice. Now let's keep going here. Let's add another class here, which is button primary. So we're just adding on to the Bootstrap styles that we have. And we'll just give it a background color of, what should we do? Well, if we go back to this page, again, we inspect right here by hovering and we click. We see over here as we scroll down what color we're using over here. Let's see. Where's the color? Let's see. Oh, there it is right here. So I'm going to copy the color, add it here. If I hit save and refresh, hey, look at that. That's really, really nice. But one thing you'll notice is that the border over here, if we scroll or zoom in, you see that the border has a bit of blue, and that's default for the Bootstrap theme. So instead, let's add a border as well. So I'll call it border color and give it the same color. If I refresh, that's much better. Although now we're hovering and it's turning blue. That's okay, but I don't like it. Let's make it hover so it's still orange, but maybe a little bit darker orange. So what can we do here? Again, we've seen this before. We can just say button primary colon hover. And in here, we can just add background color to be something a little bit different than this. In this case, we're going to use a color that is EE4B08. Don't worry, I didn't memorize this. This is just something that, well, I knew that I used when I made this website first. So don't worry, you never need to memorize hex colors. Next, we'll do the same for the border color. So once again, we'll make the border color the same as we have here. That's great. I also want to increase the border width, actually, to just make it a little bit bigger when we hover over it. So let's just give it an extra 4 pixels and let's save. If I refresh and hover, hey, look at that. That's awesome. So that's looking really, really nice. So we have the button. It's looking pretty good. We have our header. That's looking pretty great as well. The other thing I want to add is this little line here, just to give it a little extra flair to the page. And we can use something called an HR here, or a horizontal line. So the HR tag, which we can just put in between, so let's say HR, is a horizontal line. So if I refresh here, I don't know if you can see it, well, because it's dark, but let's add some styling to it. So let's say in here that we want the HRs on our page to have a border color of the orange that we've had before, which is this one over here. So let's say border color is this. If I save and refresh, all right, look at that. There's our little line. It's a little thin though, so let's add a bit of sizing. So I'll say border width and give it, let's say 3 pixels. And if I refresh, all right, that's getting bigger, that's good. But I don't want this to be the entire page. I only want it a little bit, just like we see it here. So we have a CSS property here that we can use called max width, which, as the name suggests, tells us exactly what's the maximum width of this thing. In our case, let's say 65 pixels. So if I save this and refresh, that's much better. All right, we're making progress here, but there's an issue, right? Right now we have the content that we want, but it's all over the place. It's kind of ugly, isn't it? We want everything centered, maybe around this laptop over here. And this is where Bootstrap really shines. So let's figure that out in the next video. All right, it's time to talk about layout. Now, we already learned how layout works in Bootstrap, and we talked about why Bootstrap became so popular. Now, don't worry, later on in the course, I'm going to introduce you to topics like in CSS Grid and actually talk about really easy ways to do layout on a page. But for now, we want us to use Bootstrap because that's what we learned. And I'm warning you, this is going to seem very overwhelming. I want to show you how Bootstrap does layout because down the road, when I introduce you to things like CSS Grid, you're going to see how much easier we have it now than we had maybe a few years ago. But I still want you to learn how layout is done in Bootstrap because you will encounter it throughout your career. Now, if you go to the layout section on the Bootstrap documentation, you see over here that it has some pretty good information. We can look at the grids, and we've already talked about how grid works with Bootstrap. Now, the first thing we want to do is to have a container and then maybe some rows that we can use columns on. So if we go back to our page and we open up the index.html file, the first thing I want to do around the body, and one thing I'll do with my Sublime Text here is actually minimize the head tag here just so we can see a little bit. So I'm going to just click on this and look at that. It's minimized so I can just focus on the body. The first thing I want to do is say that I want to create a div with a class of container. Just like that. And then we'll close this right over here. So let's indent that properly. Let's save and refresh. All right, we have everything in a container. Next is that we want, ideally, all of these things to be in a row. So we want the H1, the HR, and the button to just be a row, one row that we have that is in the center of the page. So I'm just going to wrap this in a div and give it a class of row. So once again, let's close the div and indent this again. If I refresh, not much has changed. We may have lost the HR. We'll get back to that in a second, but we have a row now. So that if I inspect, let's say View, Developer Tools, and I click on this Inspect, I see, well, these elements. If I go over here and let's open this up, make this a little bit smaller, we see that we have the body, we have the div, which is the container, and then we have the row right here. All right, let me close this. Let's divide up these items into different sections. We have the header element that we can use, and this header element will contain the H1 over here. So we have the header, and one thing that we can use with Bootstrap is a class called Text Center. And Text Center, as you might guess, if I refresh, centers the text. So that's great. That's our header element. And we also want to create another section here. Let's call it section. So this is a section element. And this section element will also have the class Text Center. So if I refresh, there you go. We got our HR, horizontal line back. And, why isn't this centered? Let's inspect this and find out. So I can open Developer Tools by pressing Command Option I or Control Option I if you're on a Windows. And let's look at the elements. We have the container, we have the row, we have the header, and then we have the section. Now, we see over here that these ones aren't taking up the full width as we would want of the container. And we've seen this before with Bootstrap, right? We have to use this columns to tell it, hey, we want to contain or expand along the column. And because Bootstrap uses a 12 grid system, we can just say in here that the header, we want the column 12 grid. And then for the section, we want the column 12 grid. So if I refresh, There you go, look at that. If I go over here, I see that we have the row, we have the header, and then we have the text, which as you can see contains the full amount of the container in the blue. That's looking a lot better. That's great. Now if I close this, our text and button, it's still at the top. Ideally, it's in the middle of the image. How can we fix this? Now, this part is really, really tricky. If I actually search vertical alignment here, you'll see that Bootstrap has some vertical alignment options, but these ones are using inline, inline block, inline table, which is actually not the recommended way. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to use Flex. And this is a new feature with Bootstrap because they're using the Flexbox utilities that we've learned about, right? So if I go over here, you can see that I can activate the Flexbox system by using the dflex class. So if I copy this and go to container and say dflex, if I refresh, all right, nothing happened because we've just enabled Flexbox. But now we want to make sure that we can place things vertically in the center. And this, if we scroll down, is what we want right here. Align items. If we look over here, it's align items center. So if I copy this, which is this one over here, and we add align items center. If I refresh, this isn't working. And this is a little tricky. And I'm showing you this just to understand how to debug things. So let's say you just did this and for some reason, you don't understand why this isn't working. On the documentation page, clearly, it shows us that this should be working. Well, we can inspect, so let's right-click, inspect, and have a look at our HTML page. We have the container and then the body. Now you see here how everything is in the container. And as a matter of fact, if we look at the container, we're actually aligning items in the center because the container is actually not the full page. It's only the top part, right? It's just this part. So here, the container is not fully covering the page. So what we need to do, just like we have in body, if we look at style here, you see how we have height of 100%? All we need to do is tell the container that, hey, I want you to span the entire height of the page. And in Bootstrap, we can do that by saying height 100 instead of adding the CSS style. If I save this and refresh, look at that. If I hover, you'll see that my container is now the full length of the page. And our writing is right in the middle. If I scroll up or down, look at that. It's adjusting properly. Everything is centered. That's great. Now, don't worry if this takes you a long time to figure out. Sometimes it involves Googling around, figure things out. Like I said, later on in the CSS layout section of the course, I'll actually show you how to make this so much simpler. Now, the last thing I want to do is, well, right here. I want to have a bit of space between the writing and the button. So what can we do here? I want another section in between these two to hopefully buffer them away from each other. So we can create that fairly easily. We can just add a new div and we'll give it a class here of buffer that we'll have to write ourselves. And this buffer class will be in between the header and then the horizontal line and the button. So let's also give this a column of 12 because we want to make sure that it covers the entire area. But right now, there's nothing. If I right-click here and inspect, you'll see here that I have the buffer, but the buffer doesn't have anything. It's completely empty because, well, there's nothing inside here. But we can add a style, let's say .buffer. And this buffer will have a height of, what should we say? Well, if I do, let's say 50 pixels and I refresh, look at that. I get a nice little buffer. So now if I scroll over to buffer, you see that I have a 50 pixel height buffer. But I always like using REM instead of pixels. So let's do REM. Let's see what 5 REM means. All right, that's good. Maybe a little bit more. Let's do 10 REM. Let's save and refresh. All right, that looks actually quite nice. If I close this tab, open it up. Yeah, look at that. That looks really, really nice. And there we go. We have our startup landing page right here. Everything looks pretty nice, right? And the way we've organized things seems pretty clean. Our button is, well, when we hover, available, but whenever I click on this button, nothing's happening. Ideally, we have a new page that opens up so that we can enter, or our customers can enter their emails. And this is the exciting part that we're going to get to in the next video. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. We've built our beautiful website. We've created a sign-up form. And it's fully responsive, but it's just on our computers. Let's actually put this online, on the internet, so anybody can access it. And I'm going to show you one way to do it for free. It'll take a bit of setup, but this way you'll have a website that is out there and you can showcase it to your friends. So to get started, I'm going to suggest that you go to github.com and you're going to create an account. And when we get to the GitHub and Git section, we're going to talk more about this, but GitHub is a platform for developers to showcase their work, but also put all their code and make sure that it's saved in a location. You can think of it as a resume for developers. So any developer that I know has a GitHub account, so create your own as well. It's completely free and it'll allow us to put our website online for free. So sign up now, and then I'm going to go back to my GitHub where I'm already signed in. And right here, once you're signed in, you'll get to this page and it'll say start a project. So I want you to click on start a project. And here, this is really important. You need to put the name that you have, your username of GitHub first, and then put period github.io. So you have to name your repository, so you can think of this as project name. And then you can click on create repository. You'll get this screen and it'll look very, very confusing. Don't worry, we don't need to worry about it. We're going to have to use the setup and desktop button. In order to do that, we need to download GitHub Desktop Client. So you can easily do that by downloading GitHub Desktop. There's for Mac, for Windows, whichever one you need. You can download. Once that's downloaded, let's open it up. And you can see here we have GitHub Desktop. I'm going to double click to open it. You'll get this pop-up, but you can just open. And once you have this, you can click on Clone Repository. And you will have to sign in to GitHub. So this needs to know what your account is on github.com. So I'm just going to click sign in. And again, this is, you can sign in with your own credentials here. And there you go. We should be all signed in. The next step is we're going to click on something called Clone a Repository. So we're going to click on that and we're going to search for the repository we just created. So if you remember your username.github.io, and because it's signed in to your account, it knows where to find it. So from here, I'm going to click clone. And it did a whole bunch of magic behind the scenes. Don't worry about it for now. Now, you want to open this repository in Finder. And it's going to open up your folder with your name on it. And in there, I just want you to copy and paste the 3 files that you have, your index, your style sheet, and your header. If you have any other files for your website, just keep them all in there. Just a reminder to take it out of the folder. There you have it. I don't want to delete that, so I'm going to copy that back. Okay. And once you have that there, close it. And now you'll see that you have these 3 files that you've just added. All we need to do now is just write a summary of this. So uploading website, and then commit to master. You'll need to add a summary in here, otherwise it won't let you click. You click on that, and again, something happened, some magic, but if you click on the history tab, you'll see that your files are still there. And the final thing you're going to do is click this publish branch button. If you click on this, it's doing a whole bunch of work behind the scenes, and it looks like it's done. Now here's the cool part. Let's go back to our website. And remember this screen? Well, now, if I refresh, I have my files in there. So now this location is referencing these files. And guess what? Your website's actually online. Don't believe me? Well, let's check out. All we need to do is go to this link, type it into the bar, press enter, and there you go. We have our website online. So now our beautiful website, our startup page, works, and people can sign up for our mailing list and check out our startup. Isn't that cool? We're going to be learning more about GitHub and Git later on in the course, and there's a special section just for it because it's a very important tool. But I wanted you to put your website online so you can show it off to your friends and family and let them know that you're going to be a pretty good developer. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. I wanted to show you another easier way to put your page online on GitHub that is fairly new. All we need to do is click on a new repository. We can create whatever we want. Startup of the year. We'll call it that for now. We'll make sure it's public. We can add a description if we want. And we can initialize this repository with a README. Now if I click Create Repository, I now have an empty project. And all we need to do here is click on Upload Files. And we can just drag and drop our files. In my case, I can just grab these 3 files we've been working on, drag them over here. It's going to upload them, and we'll just hit Commit Changes. And check it out. Once that's done, we have our page. Now, in order for this to work, we have to make sure that there's an index.html file. And all we need to do is now go to Settings, scroll all the way down to GitHub Pages right here, select the source as the master branch. And don't worry, we're going to go over GitHub and how it works later on in the course. We have a dedicated section for it, but I just want to make sure that we can put things online so you can show off to your friends. If I scroll back to GitHub Pages now, you'll see that I have your site is ready to be published right here. So I can actually copy this link or click on it, and look at that. At this URL, my website is now online. And as you can see, it works just like we had. But this time, it's an actual website online. So this link I can send to my friends and show off. Now, one thing I like to do here when I create a page on GitHub is to copy this link, go back to the project, and add it to the description here as the website, so that in the future, I can just click on here and I'm directed to my website. All right, that was a lot of work, but congratulations, you have your website online. Go share it with your friends, with your family, with your dog, with your enemies. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Welcome back to another Developer Fundamentals video. And you know who we haven't seen in a while? My friend Jean-Claude Van Damme. How are you doing these days, Jean? All right. So what is this developer fundamental that we're going to teach? Well, I have over here animate.css, and this is another CSS file that we can download to animate things. So all I need to do is click download animate.css, and I have the CSS file downloaded for me. So let's open that up. You'll see over here that, yep, this is a massive CSS file that I just downloaded. And this is how Bootstrap, that we've seen in previous videos, works. They're essentially providing a CSS file for us with all these properties already preset, and we also have all the classes that we need to use them. So let's say I wanted to use this, and I'm just going to copy this for now. And I have an empty website, and I'm just going to copy and paste this CSS for us. Just think about how powerful that is. We're able to not start from scratch, but use what other people have created to make our websites faster. To show you this, let's open up this file. So into our browser. Okay, it's completely empty. And let's just have a header 1 that says animate me. I'm going to save and refresh. And looking at animate.css, I can add let's add bounce to our header. All we need to do is click on something like view on GitHub, and it will explain for us what we can add. And I'll just save you the trouble of reading, but all we need to do is this. Copy and add the class, animated, and then whatever animation we want. In this library, that's how it works. You just need to stay a class and type animated first, and then any of the actions that were provided on the website. So in our case, it was infinite bounce. Save and refresh. And well, we haven't linked our style sheet here, so let's do that. And we should be really good at this by now because we've done it plenty of times. Save and refresh. Look at that. Our header is now animated. Let's see what else we can do with this. We can do Jello. Actually, let's do something more exciting, maybe flip. Oh, I like that one. Okay, so we want to do flip. We can type in flip and refresh here. You see that? Let's do that infinite just so we can see it. Woo, there you go. I'm going to stop that because that's going to get us dizzy. Refresh. There you go. Now, the fundamental here that I want to show you is that when we're building websites, it is very rare that we build something from scratch. Most of the time, you want to build on top of something that has already been created. Otherwise, the whole environment of being a developer would be very, very tedious. How much of a waste is it if somebody has already created a solution that you need? So as a developer, you want to be efficient with your time and your limited resources. So you want to find things like Bootstrap or even animate.css if they solve your certain problems. And that is true for CSS as well as JavaScript when we get into it. You want to find solutions that already exist, and only if they don't exist already, then you can implement your own. Finally, I wanted to show you one other tool, and that is Creative Tim. So if you click on Creative Tim, they create Bootstrap themes. They're using the Bootstrap toolkit to build their own styles and their own little customized actions to make it even better. So if I go to categories over here and we'll do UI kits, you'll see over here that they have all these things that we can use. So if we click on PaperKit 2 Pro, let's find a free one actually. If I click on price low to high, there you go. We have the Get Shit Done, and we also have PaperKit 2. So if I click on this, and I'm going to make this full screen, this allows us to build something like this very, very easily with our own custom design. And all we need to do is do a free download. And you'll see that when we download this, we have all the files that we need. And let's open it up. Look at that. We have this website that, just like Bootstrap, we can use these buttons and these different styles and navigation, progress bars, and forms, and everything that you need. And because we know now how HTML files and CSS files work, we can actually start customizing this. And we can open up an index file and start editing it. Or if we go into assets and CSS, we can start adding our own CSS values to it. And you'll see a lot of developers that do this exactly. They're freelancers and people need just websites built, and they're able to build websites really, really fast by using something like Creative Tim. Because as you can see, they've already built really nice looking components for you. There's paid ones that you can get, and that is one avenue that you can go. But I do argue that these type of websites can only take you so far. And in order to build real applications, real complex applications, and even garner higher salaries and make your skills really valuable, we need to learn JavaScript. And we need to become better than just using templates and CSS. And that's what we're going to get into the next section. That is JavaScript. That is when the real power comes. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. Congratulations. You're actually learning quite a lot. Although things might still seem a little intimidating, you now have a newfound power where you can create websites, you can put them online. Now, there's still lots to learn, but one of the neat things about knowing how much we know now is that you can leverage other people's templates. Now, what does that mean? It means that unlike the startup landing page that we just created, you don't have to create everything from scratch. As a matter of fact, if you Google free HTML5 templates or free HTML CSS templates, there's a ton of free resources online that you can use. Now, after this lesson, I'm going to link to some of my favorite free resources, but one of them is Mashup Template. Here, you can actually use a bunch of free templates for yourself. And if I, let's say, go to Complex here, or no, let's do Factory. I can actually download the files here as HTML. And check this out. If I now open this, I now have these files. And there's a lot of files that we still don't know. There's some JavaScript here that we haven't talked about yet. And we'll cover these in later lessons. But the thing here is that you know about HTML and CSS. So now, if you actually double click on this HTML, you have a website that you can use and customize to your liking. And this website is free for you to use. You can now change the background image, you can change what the button does, you can do different things, and you can customize it just like we have with the startup landing page, but to your own liking by just changing the HTML and CSS files, which we have right here. This is the power of the web. The web allows programmers to share pieces of code so that we don't have to constantly reinvent things from scratch. Just like Bootstrap allowed us to do things easily in terms of layout, templates allow us to create websites. Instead of from scratch, we get to start with a basic template. Now, I want you to try building your own startup landing page. Up until now, I've shown you step by step, but you have the power to create something custom to your liking. You can use something like mashup templates, or you can elaborate on the current startup page. You have the power to do it. And although it may seem a little bit hard right now, we're still starting off, it's good for you to get that practice of doing things on your own, experimenting on your own. And even if you fail, even if it takes you hours to just center a text or a button, it's going to be good practice in the long run. So give it a go, create your own custom startup landing page, and if you're done, go share it in our Discord server. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. In this section, I want to tackle the problem that we have, especially when we're starting out. That is, how do I create a layout of a website? And it's probably the hardest thing to learn when you're starting off. How do you create something, let's say like this, that is responsive, that we see all across the web? A navigation bar, a header, some grids, a footer down here. And how do we really make it responsive? In this section, we're going to build an ideal web page layout so that moving forward, you have the baseline and foundation to go off and customize and build whatever sites you want that are responsive without spending a lot of time, trial and error, trying different things with CSS, hoping that it works. So I'm going to show you my recommended way of laying out web pages that is responsive and have that template available to you moving forward. We're also going to learn about a new feature in CSS called CSS Grid, which is really, really powerful. And as you'll learn, allows us to use this CSS Grid combined with Flexbox to honestly not even need things like Bootstrap 4 or other libraries that allow you to do grids. Back in the day, it was really, really hard to do layout in CSS. But with tools like CSS Grid and Flexbox, you now have the abilities to really build beautiful, responsive layouts really, really fast. So let's get started. I'll see you in the next video. Welcome back. When it comes to layout using CSS, a very important skill of a developer, there are probably 3 really good ways to do it this year. One is something that we've discussed, and that is Flexbox. Another one was Bootstrap 4. And we're going to learn about a new way of doing it, which is called CSS Grid. And if you go for a Google image search and type in something like CSS Flexbox versus Grid, you're going to get a lot of images explaining what the differences are, why you would use one over the other. But I want to just preface the next couple of videos and let you know that there's no one versus the other, one that wins out over the other. There's always a trade-off. And the best way to think about these tools is as complementary tools. That is, they both work really, really well together. You don't only have to use just Flexbox or just CSS Grid. Ideally, use them both together. And I'll show you later on how we can use both Flexbox and CSS Grid to pretty much do anything we want when it comes to layout. But just to start us off, a good way to think about Flexbox versus CSS Grid is that Flexbox is really good to use if you just have one-dimensional. Maybe you're only thinking about columns and how to do layout based on columns. CSS grids are really, really powerful, especially when it comes to two-dimensional layouts. That is, both columns and rows. So it's really, really good at, let's say, image galleries or listing out your portfolio projects on your own personal webpage. And we'll get into that. But now you might be asking yourself, okay, isn't this what Bootstrap allows us to do? And you'd be right. Bootstrap came at a time when we didn't have Flexbox and CSS Grid. It came at a time when we just had display and floats and positioning, CSS properties that, as we saw, are really, really difficult to use when it comes to layouts. And Bootstrap solved that problem. It gave us this grid system that we can use within Bootstrap to make really beautiful layouts. So that was really, really useful. But on your resume, if you say that you know Bootstrap 4, yeah, that's good, but it won't be that impressive to employers anymore, especially if you're going for a real developer job, which is why I haven't focused too much on Bootstrap 4, because I argue that everything that you can do in Bootstrap 4, although sometimes it's easy because it comes with their own pre-built components, you can do now using Flexbox and CSS Grid. And because being a good developer means not just learning one library that always changes, always evolves, it's learning the fundamentals. It's more important for us to learn Flexbox and CSS Grid because now, if we know these two, we can create any sort of layouts we want. One last thing. When it comes to CSS Grid, it's a new feature. Most web browsers have support for it, but we do see a few Reds and older versions of browsers that do not support CSS Grid. When we look at Flexbox, it's a little bit better because it's older than CSS Grid. And we've learned all about this before, right? Each browser has their own implementation and any new feature has to be implemented individually. So although CSS Grid has become pretty standard across the web, if you're trying to support older browsers or something like Opera Mini, then you might want to consider using floats to do layout. Although, to be honest, most of the web is moving towards CSS Grid and Flexbox, so I just recommend starting to use this right away because eventually this will have really, really good support. But enough talk. I think it's time for us to learn CSS grids to see what all the hype is about and start working on a fun little project. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. I've given you some starter files, so I recommend watching these videos as you code along as well on your computer. We have a few animal cards here that are extremely cute, obviously. Right now, if we look at what we have an HTML page with just simple divs that contain these little emojis of animals. And if we go to the Style tab, I've pre-filled a few things for you just so things look good. But all we're really doing here is we have a few colors and we've added gradients here just so it looks a little bit nicer. And we have the zones, which are these individual cards with some predefined CSS properties that we've already seen in the previous videos. Just with this base CSS that we see that we have some really nice looking cards. And right now we're using display inline block. If I change this to display block and I save this, let's refresh, we see that we now have blocks. That's great. But we want a little bit more control and perhaps make this grid a little bit more responsive, maybe look a little bit different and just overall cleaner. And when it comes to grids, CSS Grid is a way to go. So how do we use it? Well, the first thing we need to do is to have a container around these items. So I'm just going to create a new div and give it a class of container. We can name it whatever we want, but container is a nice descriptive class name. And we wrap all the items in this container. Now, the way CSS Grid works is very similar to Flexbox. That is, we give it the property of display grid, and all the children will now be able to be part of this grid system. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to have the container class, and this container class will have display of grid. So remember, with Flexbox, we can do flex. It's similar to that. We do display grid. And we no longer want to use the display block of the zones because we're going to have a grid system. So I'm just going to comment this out for now. We've just declared this as a grid system, but we actually need to tell it what to do now. And the most important part of CSS Grid is this property, grid template columns. And most likely, you're going to be using this in all your CSS Grid implementation. And what we can use these grid template columns is to tell our page how many columns we want to use. In here, if I say something like 300 pixels and 300 pixels, I save and refresh here. Look at that. I have 300 pixels and then 300 pixels. And automatically, because I've declared it this way with two definitions or two values, it assumes that we have two grids of 300 pixels and 300 pixels. So if I make this larger or smaller, it's always going to have 300 pixels, two columns. If I add, let's say, another 300 pixels here and save, refresh, look at that. We now have 3 columns. Very, very nice. Another one that you'll see a lot of is the grid gap. And as you might guess from the name, it tells us how much gap we want between the grids. So if I do 20 pixels here and I refresh, I see that we get 20 pixels of gap. Now, this looks really good right now, but if I change things around, this isn't really responsive because each column is 300 pixels wide. And as we know, users have different display sizes. So you get these ugly grids where you have white space over here. How will we go about solving this? And you might be thinking, what if we just do percentages here? What if we had 4 columns and we say 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%? If I refresh this, look at that. I have 4 columns, but there's still some scrolling involved. Although we see that things are a little bit more responsive now. Now, you can totally do percentages with grid template columns, and it's definitely a lot better than using something like pixels. But you now have to start calculating the fact that you also have a grid gap of 20 pixels. And well, CSS Grid actually gives us a really, really good tool that I recommend you use 100% of the time instead of percentages or pixels or EMs or REMs. And that is called a FR or a fraction. Now, what does the FR syntax mean? If I do one FR here and I save, and let's refresh. All right, I get one item. FR means we have one fraction in this column, so just fill it all up. If I do one FR again, and I refresh, I get 2 columns. But look at this. As I expand and make it smaller, it automatically resizes. Because I'm saying I want 2 columns that are 1 FR, 1 FR. Now, a better way to explain what this FR value means is if I do something like 2 FR here. What do you think will happen? If I save and refresh, this should give you a better idea. All we're saying is we want 3 columns. And in terms of the proportion or the sizes, I want the first 2 columns to be half the size of the third column. Because in terms of fractions, this is twice as big as the other ones. As I make this larger and larger, it's always going to say and keep those proportions. This is going to be twice as large as the other ones. So when you're using CSS Grid, this is the best way for you to maintain this grid system and make sure that it's responsive. How cool is that? Just by writing 3 properties saying that we want to use the grid system, adding maybe a grid gap and grid template columns with these FR values, we've made a grid system that is quite responsive. But there are a few more properties that we can use in CSS Grid, so let's check them out in the next video. Welcome back. Now that we've gotten used to the CSS Grid system, let's introduce a few more properties. Now, another thing we can do with CSS Grid, because remember, I said it was two-dimensional. That is, we can control the rows as well. So far, this is something that Flexbox can do as well. We can do something like grid template rows now, and actually define the way the rows should look as well. So let's say I want to do 1 FR, 2 FR. What do you think will happen? Let's see. I'm going to save and refresh. And look at that. The first row is 1 FR, but the second row is twice as big as the first one, as we can see here. And because of the way CSS Grid works, in the third row, because we haven't really added a third column, automatically, if there's more items, it's going to just start repeating. So the next row, which is the third row, will have 1 FR. So I can define different things here. I can say 3 FR for the third row, and let's say 5 FR for the last row. If I refresh and save here, whoops. If I save and refresh here, we see that we have our new columns or rows. But that looks ugly, so let's just keep it at 1 FR, which is the default. Now, another thing that we can do, and that you'll see a lot of, is the repeat function that we can add to something like grid template columns. So instead of doing this over here, I can say repeat brackets. And now I say how many times I want to repeat something. So the first number is how many times. So let's say 3 times. Repeat 1 FR. So that's like saying 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR 3 times. If I save this and refresh, I get 1, 2, 3. If I do 4 here and I refresh, I get 4. And you can imagine what happens if we do 6. We just keep repeating things. Another thing that we can do is the auto property. And the auto property just simply means fill in whatever available space we have. So if I do something like auto 1 FR, 2 FR, and I refresh here, you'll notice that the first column doesn't really have any spaces outside of the emoji. And auto can also be thought of as the max size of the content. If I make this Fox, let's say have a content of 2, and I refresh, you'll see that the auto property automatically resizes to fit the content. And because this entire layout is on a grid system, it'll make sure that the ones below it will have the same size. If I do 1 FR here and I refresh, you'll see the difference of what we're talking about. It's not automatically scaling this first grid. Instead, it's going to keep the proportions that we have and extend anything below it that doesn't fit. So auto is another really, really good feature to use. But let's fix that. All right, let's tackle a few more properties in the next video. Another property that is very important when it comes to CSS Grid is justify items. And justify items, and the default is right now stretch. So that if I refresh this, nothing's going to change. But if I do start and refresh, it aligns the contents in a grid item along what we call the row axis. So the row axis is each row. If I do end and I refresh, we see that they're now towards the end. But a better way to visualize this is to actually use our developer tools. So if I go to View, Developer, Developer Tools, and we select our grid, you see that by clicking on this pointy icon and hovering over it, in Google Chrome, we actually see our grid system. And if I scroll, you see that it actually stays in place. But you see that we now have our items at the end of our grid system. Our last item, which is 2FR, right over here, is justified to the end. Our second column is justified to the end, and we see a bit of a gap here. And that is because, remember, we have 1FR. And then the first item, because it's auto and the size is according to its content, doesn't really move. Whether we have end or start here, it's already within the maxed space of the grid system. And just like we have the axis around the row, if I change this to align items, and I save and refresh, this one's hard to see, so let's just do 5 or 300 pixels and refresh here. We see that align items is the exact opposite, where it's around a column axis. And we can use start end here to move those grid boxes around. But most of the time we want this filled and we don't want to move items around, so I don't really like using those two properties. So let's fix that to 1FR. If I refresh, all right, we have things back to normal. I'm going to close this. Now, the last thing I want to show you inside of this container is my preferred method of actually creating a grid layout in any website that I built. And what I usually like to do is something new that we haven't seen before. I usually do repeat and define here how many rows I want. Let's say I want 3 at 1FR. So I want everything to have the same size. But there's a problem here, right? Because right now, this is stretching, but as soon as we make it too small or too big, it's not extremely responsive, or it's not 100% responsive. So instead, I like using autofill. And in autofill, just to show you what it does, if I do something like 300 pixels and I refresh, and now I change the sizing, you'll see that our grid system or the column system adjusts autofills according to the size of our viewport, which is really, really nice. But right now, I just said 300 pixels. So again, it's not super, super responsive. So instead, we can use something else called the min-max. And I know this can look confusing, but if you remember this pattern, this is the most common pattern I would say to use when it comes to CSS Grid. So once you get used to this, you can just copy and paste it and use it everywhere. And here, what we want to do is say, well, the minimum that we want the size of our columns to be, let's say I want the minimum to be 200 pixels. So that's the smallest it's going to get. The max though, how big do we want these to get? And this is a common thing. What do we want as the biggest? Well, just 1FR. Because as we will see, by doing this, it'll automatically adjust to the size of the viewport. Let me just save and show you what I mean. If I refresh here, I see I have 3 here. It auto adjusts based on our size. But you also see that the container itself is also adjusting in size. So that if I go smaller and smaller and smaller, look at that. As soon as we hit the 200 pixel minimum, it adjusts. And because we set 1FR as the max, as soon as the viewport is really, really small and goes below 200 pixels, it's going to just take up one fraction. And in our case, it'll be the entire screen. So using this syntax of repeat autofill min-max, giving it a minimum, we're able to make this completely responsive. And as you can see here, it's pretty powerful, right? In just a few lines of code, we've made this grid system that is completely responsive. All right, up to this point, we've just focused on the container. But what about the individual items? What if we want something that's maybe bigger than the other item, and we don't want them all symmetrical like this? What would we do? Let's find out in the next video. Welcome back. Let's talk about individual items now when it comes to CSS Grid. Because up until now, we've just used this container and performed operations or changed views to all the items. But what if we wanted a bit of a funky grid system that has different sizing? In that case, we can just select individual items within this container. If we go back to our HTML page, we see that we have these zones, but each zone has different color. So let's use one of these colors, for example, green, which we have two of, to have some special CSS Grid properties. So let's have a green class. And I'm just going to do it up here instead of at the bottom, so we can keep all the CSS Grid things at the top. Now for individual items, I can say something like grid column and say what we want it to do in terms of the column grid system. And the way this works is we can give it where it should start and where it should end. What does that mean? Well, if I do grid column start and I say 1, and then have grid column end, and I give it 2, and I refresh the page, nothing changes. What if I do grid column 3 and I refresh? Whoa, what just happened here? In order for us to understand what these numbers mean, let's open up the developer tools once again. I'm going to select the items. And as we'll see over here, we see that we have a grid zone, and this fox is now taking up 2 grid spaces. And the way CSS Grid works, it has a numbering system where the first line over here is 1, the second line over here is 2, and then this is 3. Let's just make this a little bit bigger to show you. That's better. We now have 3 grid systems, or 3 grid items. We have 1 here when the first one begins, 2 where the second one begins, and then 3 where the third one begins. So what we're saying here is that when it comes to columns, start at 1, which is right over here, and then end at 3. So that if I do 4 here and I refresh, you see that it now covers the entire length. But as soon as we make it a little bit bigger, well, it only is going to cover the 1, 2, 3, up to 4. And if we make it a little bit smaller, you see that because we said 1 to 4, it doesn't actually make it as responsive as it was before, and it actually extends to make sure that it fills in 1 to 4. And there's a shorthand way of doing this. Instead of saying grid column start and grid column end, we can just say grid column and then give it the start number and then slash the end number. So that if I refresh, you see that it's the same thing. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And let's just do 3 here just to keep it small. All right, I'm going to close this. And we see that our grid items now have, well, this looks pretty good actually. We have the green classes that span over more grids. Now, a trick here is that sometimes we just simply don't know what the user is going to see. And we might want this to span the entire length without having, the rabbit come in and then the frog and the lion come in. And we can actually do at the end here something like -1, which means all the way till the end. If I refresh here, there you go, and make this larger and smaller, we see that we are saying start at 1 and then keep going all the way until the end. In CSS Grid, -1 signifies the end of the viewport. So that now we see that we have a nice responsive grid again that just adjusts according to our viewport. Very, very cool. Now, sometimes we don't really know how many grids we're going to have on our page. And we also might not necessarily want it to span it all across from beginning to end. So a useful syntax here is to do something like span 2, which says span across 2 grids. If I refresh here, you see that green is spanning across 2 grids. If I do 3, it's going to span across 3 grids. And as you can imagine, the default is span 1, spanning across 1. But the interesting thing about this is if I do, let's say, span 2, and I refresh, as this gets smaller, you see that it's always going to span across to make sure that it covers whatever the 2 grids are, which is, once again, very useful. Finally, we can also do the same thing with rows. If we do grid rows or grid row, I can say, well, we want it to span to start at, let's say, 1 and end at 3. If I refresh here, look at that. Whoa, what just happened here? Well, let's take a look. We start at 1 and end at 3. And because green is also this unicorn over here, it automatically moved it all the way up because we want it to start at 1 as well. And remember, our grid system now is row, and if I open the developer tools and select the grid, 1 starts here, then 2, then 3 right here where it ends. So you have to be careful with the positioning here that this is going to move whatever it needs to all the way up to 1. But we're able to move things around and adjust the rows as well. Very, very cool. Our grid system is starting to look really, really nice. Let's do a bit more in the next video. Another thing I want to show you with the individual item in a grid is that we can do something like justify self. Remember, up here we did justify items and align items, but when it comes to individual items, we have to use self. And as you can imagine, if I do self start and I refresh here, we go to the start of the column. If I do align, it's going to go to the start of the row. And if we do end and refresh, again, we see that the same thing is happening. I'm going to leave this file for you as well so you can play around with it. I encourage you to try to create different types of grids and looks that you want. As you can see, it's pretty powerful, but also very, very simple, and allows us to create responsive grid systems very, very easily. Now, there's actually a cheat sheet that you can use to summarize everything that I've taught you up until now that I'll link to in this video. It's called the grid cheat sheet. And it shows you exactly what you need to do for the container. We've learned about grid gap, grid templates, align items, and also what to do with the children, such as grid column, justify self, align self, and it has all these little snippets that you can just click on and copy. So I recommend you play around with some of these properties on your own, because in the next part, we're going to use CSS Grid to build a complete website layout. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Now, up to this point, we learned about HTML, CSS, templates, and learned how to do layout with things like Flexbox and CSS Grid. And probably the most important thing that you need to know from these sections is how to create a website, right? How to lay out a website, but also not spend a lot of time on simple tasks. Because when we get to the JavaScript section, which is the more exciting actual logic programming part of the course, that's when you truly become a developer. Up until now, with what we've learned is the foundation that allows us to build web apps and applications, but you're never going to actually get interviewed about these specific topics. I mean, yes, in small cases you might be. If you're a designer, you might get asked questions about CSS and HTML, but most of the time, the questions you'll be asked is on things like JavaScript, logic, and more complex topics that we're going to cover later on in the course. But the one thing that I really want you to take away from this section is being able to build websites fast. Or at least get to the part where you need to start writing JavaScript, because that's where your real job begins. So I have a task for you. Using all the skills that you've learned up until now, I want you to create a layout of a website, something that you're going to do over and over throughout your career. And I've created a small starter file here, where we have these little button-like containers, or divs. But as the name suggests, I want you to align these in a responsive way to something that looks like this. I know it's not the prettiest thing right now to look at, and we're only focusing on layout. But what I want you to do is to make the header green button over here be an actual header. We want the cover to be, well, the actual cover of our website. And then maybe have a project grid where we list all of our projects like we have over here. And then obviously a footer at the bottom. And I've selected this layout because it's a very common pattern that you'll see in a lot of websites. So you're going to be doing this a lot. So let's figure out the best way to go about doing this so that when I make this smaller, it's all responsive. So your task is to use whatever you've learned up until now to create this using the starter files. And don't worry, I'll have a solution video for you after this. And we'll also go into how easy it is once you have a layout, which is the recommended way to build a website, starting with the layout first. And then once you have the layout fixed, converting this into something usable like this. Because styling becomes really, really easy once you have the layout in place. Now, the one hint that I want to give here is to use both Flexbox and CSS Grid to accomplish your goal. Although anything you can do in Flexbox, you can do with Grid and vice versa, or at least most things, using the tools in combination, Flexbox and CSS Grid together is really, really powerful to allow you to build a layout like this. So good luck. I know it's going to be tough, but I'll see you in the solution video. Bye-bye. Welcome back. How was the exercise? Hopefully it wasn't too difficult. But if it was and you weren't able to finish it, don't worry. We're going to go over the steps. And luckily for you, once we do this, you'll have a template that you can use for all your websites. Because what we'll build will be something responsive that you can customize to your own liking. But you'll at least know the best practices after this video of how to do these common patterns that we see in a lot of websites. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do to convert this page is, well, a few things. Let's go to the HTML page first. And let's start off with the navigation. That is the header over here. A lot of websites have some sort of a header at the top. The first thing I want to do is to actually use semantic HTML and be more descriptive in what we are doing. So in our case, instead of div, I'm going to use the nav HTML element. And this is something that we've already talked about. And instead of just having header here, I'm going to have a UL class or UL element that will have a class name of main nav. And in here, we can just have li elements that will have an anchor tag. And because we won't have any links for this example, we can obviously do whatever new HTML page that we want to reference. But for now, we can just leave it blank. So the first one will, let's just say, be about. And we can copy and paste this for the other items as well. We'll have, let's just say, products. We'll say our team. And then finally, we'll have contacts. If I save this and refresh, there's our navigation. Doesn't look very good, does it? In real life, most of the time we see the navigation at the top, and sometimes we also see that there's navigation links at the top and one all the way to the right that's pushed to the right edge, such as contacts. So let's try and do that, where we have about, products, and our team at the top over here, and then contacts all the way to the right at the very edge. So for that, we can create a new class at the very last item that we want to, let's say, push, and we'll add these CSS classes now. If I go to, or let's save this first. If I go to Style, CSS, we can create our navigation here now. We have the main nav class, which we've created. And in here, we want to use Flexbox. So I'm going to say display flex to activate Flexbox. It sounds cool when I say activate Flexbox. I want to make sure I remove these little dots in front of the name, so I can just say list style none, which will remove these little pointers. And let's say that we want the font size to be, let's say, 0.7 EM. If I save and refresh here, all right, things are a little bit better, but still not perfect. One is we want to remove any margins. So I'm going to say margin 0. If I refresh, all right, we've removed some margins, but still not pretty. We want to perhaps add some spaces in between these things. I'm going to just have the li class, which is our navigation items, and I'll just say that we want the padding to be 20 pixels. I refresh. That's a lot better. Okay. And just to clean things up, let's say that our anchor tags, we also want them to be, well, to have a color of, let's just use F5, F5, F6. If I refresh, it's nice and whitish. That looks good. And we don't want those underlined, so I'm going to say text decoration, none. Refresh, all good. Now, because I want to start structuring this as an actual web page, I'm going to go to our zone class and just remove our padding and margin because we don't really need it. Refresh here. Things are going to start looking ugly, but at least we've moved all this white space. And then finally, our display, we're no longer going to use inline block. We want to start using our Flexbox or CSS grid. In our case, our main nav is going to have flex display. So we don't need our inline block anymore. I'm going to save and refresh, and that's a lot better. Because divs are automatically blocked, our displays for these bottom ones are now going to just be blocks, but our top one, our nav bar, has flex now, which is great. But you'll notice here we have a bit of a white gap. And this is very common when you're working with CSS. Sometimes browsers by default have some sort of CSS attached to them. In this case, in Google Chrome, our body element already has some predefined CSS classes that are pre-built by Chrome. So we can actually remove those and make sure that our margins are 0 by saying margin auto 0. And this is something, oh, make sure I spell that right. This is something that you'll see a lot of, and you'll do a lot of when it comes to just making sure that the styles, or at least the margins, are correct when you start off. So if I refresh here, look at that. Margins are gone and everything is filled on the page, which is great. The last thing I want to do is to move contacts all the way up to the right. And remember the push class that we added? Well, that's going to be super easy to do. All we need to do is to add a push CSS class that says margin left to be auto. And with this auto, if I refresh, contacts goes all the way to the right. If I inspect this element, so I just right click and click on inspect, and let's make this a little bit bigger so we can see. If I hover over li push here, we see that each li element has its own box, but because we did margin left auto, our li element, it's going to get automatically pushed because it has this automatic margin that it creates to the very end. If I did margin right, for example, and I refresh here, our margin would now actually be all the way to the right to fill up the entire width of the viewport. But let's go back to left. Oops. Let's go back to left, save, and refresh here. The neat part about this is that with this margin left auto, I can now resize our page, and you'll see that contacts is always going to be to our right. This is something that you'll see in a lot of websites, and we did that fairly fast. Not too bad, right? The last thing that I want to fix here is, as we'll notice, as we get closer and closer, it kind of overlaps our team, and well, now we have this weird little contacts that overflows. How can we fix this? Let's tackle that in the next video. Welcome back. In the last video, we had this problem of the view getting a little bit ugly with our navigation as we became smaller and smaller with our viewport. How can we fix this? And here, I want to show you a topic that I actually cover in my next course. But just because it might be useful for this case, I'm going to introduce you to something called media queries. And media queries allow us to create responsive websites and tell our web pages what to do when the size of our screen gets small or big. And I'll link to this website over here. But essentially what it allows us to do with media queries, we can have devices, tablets, laptops, wearables that have different screen sizes and tell it how to display our web page based on those sizes. For example, here, it shows us what our viewports will be for iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S. And using this syntax of @media only screen and giving it some minimum device width and max device width, we can tell it how to display our page or have CSS properties specific to just this view size. That is, minimum view size is going to be 320 pixel and max is 480 pixels. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of these based on different devices and viewports. Now, things like CSS Grid and Flexbox actually resolve a lot of this, but I want to demonstrate just one use case with our little example. That is this contacts getting smushed. So let's create our own media query for our navigation. In order to do that, all we need to do is say @media. We say only screen, and this is saying, what do we want our media query for? And you can do things like print here, for example, when you're printing something, but 99% of the time, you're just going to have screen. And here we're going to say, and we'll say that max width is going to be 600 pixels. That is, use this CSS properties that we're about to define right here only when max width is 600 pixel. That is, As soon as this is less than 600 pixel in width, I apply these properties here. So I'll say main nav will have a font size. We can do different things here, but let's just say a smaller font size. And maybe we'll do padding of 0, just so they're closer together. If I save this and refresh, look at that. Everything fits in because our font size is smaller and we've removed any extra padding that we may have. But notice here as I make things bigger. You see that? As soon as I pass 600 pixels, we restore our defaults with larger font size. Look at that. So using media queries, we just made our nav bar more responsive. Nice and easy. And this is a common pattern that I recommend with your navigation. That is having our nav element with an unordered list and an li list. Our main nav, which will be a flexbox. And we'll have a push class that uses this margin left auto to push whatever we want to our nav to the right side, usually something like contacts or login to have it all the way to the right. So hopefully this wasn't too bad. Like I said, you don't need to memorize this. You can even copy the code that I'll leave for you at the end of these videos. Once you get used to this syntax, you now have a solid foundation to build a navigation. But we have 3 more things to go, so let's get to that in the next video. Welcome back. Now that we have our navigation, let's focus on our cover. If we go back to our HTML page, we have our cover div here. And we can just keep the div here as it is, because we won't really know what the cover will be just yet. But I want to add a new CSS class called container here. And this container is going to define some properties for us that will make this truly a cover image, just like we have in our solution webpage over here. And let's add those exclamation marks because we're excited. Oh, not for context. For the cover, let's add the exclamation marks over here. Nice. All right, we'll go to our style.css. And we'll add on our cover style now. This is actually going to be fairly easy. We want to have, let's say, display of flex. Or first of all, let's make sure that we have the container class. And we'll have a display of flex. And I'm not using grid here because, well, we're not going to have any grid items. We won't have that many items in a cover. It's usually a button or a background image or some text. And display flex just makes things nice and simple. And usually we want things in the cover to be centered. That is, we want this cover to be right in the center. And as we make things smaller, it's always going to be in the center. That's something that we see a lot of in a lot of websites. And to do that, especially with Flexbox, is really easy. All we need to say is to align items, center, and to justify content, center. Just like that. If I save here and refresh, all right, this is centered. And as I move things, perfect. Everything is absolutely centered. But obviously, cover image should be a little bit larger, right? What do we do here? And I want to introduce to you something that you haven't seen before. But don't get scared. It's not that hard. I'm going to have height. And just to start us off, I'm going to show you, usually you might do something like 500 pixels. And if I refresh, awesome. I have a nice little height. But there's a problem here, right? Because I'm saying 500 pixel here. If the viewport, if I move things around, if I lift things up, you'll see that, all right, the view is not responsive when I go up because it's always 500 pixels. And this might not be the worst idea ever. Maybe you want your website to be like that. But if you do want this to be responsive in terms of going up and down as well, what we can do is use something called VH. That is the viewport height. And I like using viewport height, a new unit that we haven't seen before, for making things responsive when it comes to height. And what this states, it's going to look at the viewport, that is the view of the web page, and make sure that there's always a percentage of that viewport dedicated to this container. So if I do 50 VH, and if I refresh here, you'll see that my cover will be 50% of our viewport. If I do 100 and I refresh, you see that the cover fills up the entire viewport. The cool part is if I go up and down, this adjusts exactly according to the viewport height, that is the window of the browser. Very cool, right? And everything is still centered. So I like using the VH for something like a container. So let's keep it at 50. And if I refresh, look at that. Nice and responsive. How cool is that? And that's it for the cover. Not that hard, right? Let's move on to the project grid in the next video. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Let's move on to the project grid. Something that we see a lot of in websites, whether it's an image gallery or a list of your portfolio projects. Grid systems are very important and very common. And as we know, we learned the perfect way to create a grid, CSS grid, right? So let's see how this would look like and my ideal implementation. First, I want to go to the HTML page. And now let's make this a little bit bigger. In our project grid div, I know I want to use CSS grid, so I'm going to create a wrapper around this project grid. So I'm going to have a div. And this div will have a class of some properties that we'll add CSS to. And just to keep things blue the way they are, I'm going to give it the zone blue class that we have below. But we're going to make it a CSS grid, so I'm going to just say grid wrapper. And we can just remove the project grid. And in here, add a couple of sample little projects. If you remember in our solution file, I left for you a couple of images that you can just add like this so that we have some sort of a project grid. I'm not going to bore you with me typing all of that out because that's something that we've done before. I'm just going to copy and paste a div here with box zone. Box is a class that we haven't added yet, but we're going to create. These are going to be the grid items. We have zone, which again, something that we've already defined before, and our images. That's it. So if I save this and refresh, and let's refresh again. All right, this is absolutely hideous. Does not look pretty at all, but at least we have the images provided. But no employer is going to be impressed if they see this, right? So let's actually make this into a grid system. If we go back to the Style tab, let's add our grid here. And obviously, as the name suggests, when it comes to grids, CSS grids is the way to go. And there's many ways that we can lay things out, and it's something that we've already talked about in our CSS grid videos. So we're going to keep things simple. First is we want to actually say, hey, we're going to use CSS grid. So we're going to use the grid wrapper class that we created, which was this div that wraps all our projects. And we'll say display grid. We'll say that we want the grid gap to be 20 pixels. And then finally, our favorite property, that is grid template columns. And so everything is responsive. We'll say repeat, auto fill. And we'll say that the min max will be, let's say 350 pixels. So that is the minimum. And the maximum will be 1 FR, so that it fills the entire page when it's really, really small. So that if I save this and refresh, all right, that still looks pretty hideous, doesn't it? And that's because our images are, well, they're pretty massive, and you see that they're also not all the same size, or they have different padding. So the way to just fix that quickly, and something that you'll see a lot with images, is to give them a width of 100%. In our case, we can just say box, because remember, each div has a box class that we haven't really said anything about, and then an image. So using our CSS selector knowledge, I can just say all children of box that are images, I want the width to be 100%. If I save and refresh, all right, that's perfect. Now you see that each image has 100% width. That is, it fills in the entire piece of the card. And if I make this bigger and smaller, you see that it adjusts. Very, very cool, but still pretty ugly. But we have the CSS grid working. As you can see, as soon as it's less than 350 pixels, it changes the grid system. All right. So next we want to work on the individual cards. That is, we want to have our box. And here, we don't really need to add any extra grid properties. I mean, we could if we want, but I like the way things look. I like everything being symmetrical. I want all the items in the grid to be the same. So in here, we can just add our simple CSS properties like, let's say, background color. And we'll just give it a color of, let's say, 444, so that we have this dark color. And we definitely don't want these images to be this big. So we'll give it a padding of 130 pixels and maybe some margin as well of 20 pixels. If I save and refresh, that's a lot better. And remember, because we said that the width of the image is 100%, it's going to try and fill the entire box, but because the box now has padding of 130, both at the top, the bottom, and to the left and right, the width is now just this part. So that looks a lot better. And if we look over here, we now have a completely responsive grid system. How cool is that? And how simple was that using CSS Grid? Luckily for us, the last thing we need to do is this footer. And because the footer is at the very bottom, it's just going to stay at the very bottom. The only thing that we might want to do is to make sure that the text is centered. So in our case, we can just say footer. And as you guessed, yes, it's text align, our best friend, center. If I refresh, and make sure that I spelled properly. If I save and refresh, well, that's not going to work because we should change our footer, which is div, to more of a semantic HTML tag of footer. Now, if I save and refresh, this is in the center. It looks great. Let's say 0 to mastery because our layout is looking really nice. And there you have it. That wasn't that bad, was it? I mean, sure, the first time around, that's kind of difficult, but the principles that I've showed you here can be transferred to a lot of websites. I mean, this looks pretty ugly. You're not going to want to visit a website that looks like this. But when it comes to layout, everything is responsive and nice, right? And you can imagine yourself expanding on this and building a beautiful website. I wanted to show you this layout system because this is what I would use if I was building a website. I would start off with the HTML and create the layout that is responsive. Because after this, all I really need to do is add text, images, and colors, maybe some CSS styles to make it pretty. so that you can turn something like this that doesn't look good but has the layout implemented into something like this, which, I mean, doesn't look that great yet, but in the next video, I want to show you how, because we have the layout set up, we can convert our base layout project into something like this in less than 5 minutes. So let's do that in the next video. Welcome back. Let's take just 5 minutes to quickly make this website a little bit prettier. Just to show you how easy it is to customize a website once you have the layout done. A recommended step that I've mentioned multiple times. When you build a website, figure out your layout, make it responsive, and once that's done, the rest is kind of fun. You just add nice CSS properties, some images to just prettify it. So in our case, I want to show you a website called, well, noshit.xyz. And it's going to really help you out because, well, it gives you free design resources to use. And they have fonts, illustrations, mockups, UI kits, everything for free that you can use on your website. In our case, we can use something like OnDraw over here that gives us a ton of MIT illustrated or licensed illustrations. So if I go to Browse Now, we see that we have a ton of images that we can use. So in my case, I've downloaded one of these images, and we're going to use it as our cover photo. So let's go back to our project, and in my cover photo over here, instead of just having cover with exclamation marks, I'll just have an image tag that will have a class of cover, a CSS property that we're gonna, or CSS class that we'll use. And it's going to link to the image that I just downloaded in my images folder. Again, this should already be in your starter files that I gave to you. So if you look in that folder, you'll see that we have an image folder. And from there, we're gonna grab the ondraw.jpg. If I save this and refresh, and make sure I finish that off with an ending bracket, and I refresh, and this is a PNG. Let's refresh. That's a lot better, but oh boy, that's a big image. We can easily fix this by going to our style, going to our cover, and using the cover class that we've added to the image to just say that we want the width to be, well, we can say 100%, but that might be too big. I don't like it that big. Let's do 30 EM. If I refresh, or REM, if I refresh, that's better. But we want to get rid of this red background now. Let's have everything in white. Just going to go up to our zone, and we can just actually remove the red from here. If I refresh, much better. That looks a lot better. All right. So as we see, the image size isn't growing, which is good, but it looks nice and pretty as the cover photo. Another thing that I noticed is that when I scroll down, I want the header tab to be sticky, that is to scroll with me. And that's another common pattern that we'll see that's fairly easy to do. We can just give the nav element a sticky class, and this sticky class can say that it'll have position of fixed and a top of 0, that is, start at the top. And if I refresh this, it will actually, because of the position fixed, although it works now, it messed up our width. So we want to make sure that the width is always 100%. So all we would do is at the end say width 100%. Again, these three properties together is a common pattern that you'll see to make navigation sticky. So that now when I scroll down, look at that, our navigation is nice and sticky. Let's make the green navigation bar blue. So I'll turn this into blue. All right, that looks a lot better. What else? We can change our font, let's say, to something prettier. Font family. Let's just say Arial. If I refresh, all right, that looks a little bit cleaner. What else can we do here? Well, just to finish it off, maybe we wanted to do something different when we hover over the zone. Let's say that with the boxes, when we hover over them, I can just copy and paste this. Let's make them tilt a little bit. So I'll say box. And instead of shadow or box shadow, we'll say transform. And we'll just say that we want to rotate, say, -7 degrees. If I save and refresh, look at that. We have some grid systems that when we hover over them, they rotate 7 degrees. I mean, I wanted to demonstrate to you how fast we can convert a website to start looking good. By no means is this perfect, but by just changing a few properties, we've now gone from this to our final view. And you can imagine how within a day of improving this website, making this a little bit prettier, maybe you really like this website's cards that they have here. So you can just inspect the element and perhaps just copy their CSS styles. But there's a lot of flexibility here. The important point, though, is the fact that you start with your layout using Flexbox and CSS Grid, and then it's really up to you and your creativity to design beautiful websites. I hope that was fun. I definitely had a lot of fun playing with CSS Grid and Flexbox, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Hey there. I wanted to take a quick video to explain something. And this is something that I made the mistake of when I first started off, when I first started teaching myself programming. You see, you start off with HTML, and things are fairly simple. You learn some tags, you learn some attributes, and you're starting to get it, how websites are built. And then you learn about CSS and all the things that you can do to websites to make them pretty and beautiful. But then you start encountering all these CSS properties. There's so many of them. There's no way for you to remember all of them. And they each act differently on the element. So that things like positioning a navigation bar becomes really difficult because you have one button that for some reason is styled differently and you can't figure out why. And that is a problem that everybody has. CSS is notoriously difficult and frustrating to learn. But this is the mistake that I made when I first started off. I thought I had to know everything in HTML, everything in CSS before I even touched JavaScript. So I spent way too much time learning everything about HTML, everything about CSS, getting frustrated because I couldn't get my websites to look like somebody that has been doing it for years. And here's the thing. If this was that easy, then every single person would be doing it. But it's not. It's tough to master these skills. But each day you make small little progress, step by step, so you become better. However, I don't want you to fall into the trap that I did. That is, to not start off learning JavaScript right away. Because you see these circles over here? These circles, the size of them, represent how important they are to your career. Now, if you want to be a web designer, designing websites and making things look pretty, then CSS is quite important to you. However, if you want to be a developer, somebody that works on logic, on JavaScript, and builds applications, well, you need to focus on JavaScript. Because although you need to know CSS, those are things that you're going to work on while working on JavaScript. So each time you're learning JavaScript and working with websites, you're also, as an effect, working with CSS. So although your knowledge might not feel complete right now with CSS, by using JavaScript and starting with JavaScript as soon as possible, we focus on the most important topic at hand. And little by little, as you're learning JavaScript, you're also going to learn more and more about CSS. So I encourage you, trust me on this, because I've been through it as well. Don't start learning every single CSS property, trying to memorize everything, because that's not how you work. A web developer is somebody that uses JavaScript to make smart applications. And that is what your focus should be on. And along the way, you will also build your HTML and CSS knowledge. And that is the path that we're taking with this course. Not the longest, slowest path, but the most efficient path. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.